Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Smart Talks by the Elizabeth Smart Foundation. I am Elizabeth, and I'm here with my co-host, Mio Strong, and I'm actually going to let her introduce our guest today. Mio.
Today, we are very excited to have with us Marty Liccardo. He works for the Department of Health in the Violence and Injury Prevention Program, and he's also on the men's health side of this. So, Marty, do you mind just explaining to us quickly about your job?
Yeah, my role at the Department of Health is I work in the area of violence and injury prevention, but specifically in sexual and relationship violence prevention. And my function there is to essentially get more men actively involved in violence prevention work. Women have been doing the bulk of this work for a very, very long time, like the last 20, 40, 2,000, 10,000 years. But what we know is that the vast majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by men. I often say to people, 98% of rape and sexual assault in the United States is perpetrated by men. Then I'll ask the common question, did I just say all men rape? And some people realize I didn't. Most men don't. Most men are wonderful, amazing people. Some of my best friends are men. I'm a man myself. So it's not a criticism of men, except to say men make up a grossly disproportionate number of the people perpetrating violence. So one of the things we often like to say is that, unfortunately, that a lot of the interpersonal violence we see, rape, sexual assault, stalking, sexual harassment, dating violence, domestic violence, is perpetrated by men, which makes this a men's violence issue and really a violence issue instead of thinking of it as a women's issue, which is what we historically have thought of this. This is not a women's issue. And men experience sexual victimization and relationship victimization at alarming rates as well. So like the fact that men can be victims of this should tell us that this is something that involves men. But unfortunately, men also perpetrate the vast majority of this. So how do we, as men, the majority of men who don't perpetrate violence, get actively involved in keeping our communities safe, keeping our relationships healthy, keeping our children healthy and safe? This is our responsibility. And I think in a lot of cases, historically, men don't see this as a men's issue. And so how do we change that scope to say, actually, it's a human issue and it's a community issue and it's a health issue?
And actually, just diving right in, how do you get more men involved? How do you get them to see that, hey, this isn't just women's issue, this is an issue for everyone? And how do you get them to engage to help in that prevention work?
That's been something that's been in some ways a struggle, because a lot of times, since men don't see themselves as potentially victims of sexual and relationship violence, they don't see this as something they need to spend their time on. And if they don't see themselves as perpetrators of violence, they don't think this is something they need to spend their time on. One of the ways we find some men who have, family, friends, or people in their lives who've experienced violence want to jump in and get involved in this work. So there's some entry points for some men that are really natural. For other men, I think, trying to help educate and motivate and make aware that violence prevention work actually makes you healthier as a man. That like the work that we do actually helps you tap into your relationships in more ways, to be a more authentic father, to be a more authentic partner, or husband, all of these different roles that men have. Sometimes we can have difficulty breaking in and understanding. I often hear people say men need to be more vulnerable. And this is something that I agree with, but I think that word in and of itself has been stigmatized culturally and socially. And really, men just need, to me, needs to be more real. Like, some men are really male identified and masculine and strong and gruff and grow big beards and are 10 feet tall and play sports, and some men don't. So we need to start, not allowing people to identify in ways that make them feel whole and honor their personhood, but also allow some variation in how we express ourselves as men and as women, as people in general. I think in some ways the opportunity to start to explore that is a way to get more men actively involved. But I often like saying, when we think about masculinity in its, you'll hear the term toxic masculinity sometimes. I have a love-hate relationship with that word. or that term. I think it's useful. I think there's great examples of it. I think rape and sexual assault would be a good example of toxic masculinity. I think sexually aggressive behavior, sexist language, catcalling, these kinds of things are great examples of toxic or hyper masculinity gone wrong. But I also think there's really good examples of healthy masculinity. And so how do we start to allow people to tap into the healthy parts of it without reverting to those things that can be harmful? Men are more likely to commit suicide. Men abuse drugs more. Men drive less safely, get in more car accidents, and die in more car accidents. Men take more risks. And I think there's something not just biological about that, there's something cultural about that as well. And so trying to figure out how to say, how do we allow you to be the best and most man you can be, in whatever that means, while also being the best member of our community and connected to that community and the healthiest man you can be. So that was a really long answer, I guess, to your question. But to me, I think trying to get men involved is really multifaceted. And men are going to get involved in different ways and different reasons. But to me, I would much rather say, what is it? How do we promote the notion of healthy masculinity in families? And instead of talking about what is bad masculinity, instead of talking about what is toxic, let's start talking about what is healthy. Let's start promoting and making men more aware of this is an example of healthy masculinity that we should honor and support.
Yeah. How do you teach that? I mean, how do you how do you teach it?
I think we do it in a variety of ways. I think we get certainly there's kind of three branches of this. There's awareness, right? Like making people aware that there is a problem or that this is a problem that affects you and you're part of it. That's the first step. Easier in some places and harder in others. I think that we start with education in some cases. One of the methodologies we like to promote at the Department of Health is bystander intervention.
Yes.
This is asking people to get more actively involved when they see harm or violence or just antisocial or negative behavior, whether it's associated with masculinity or other things, like asking people, if you see something that feels unright, get involved to help somebody. If you see somebody who's being targeted or harmed, whether it's bullying, whether it's peer pressure to do something that they don't want to do, whether it's, or to the extreme of someone committing an act of violence, two people getting in a fight, or a person in a bar getting so incapacitated that someone is carrying them off. Any of these situations are moments where we definitely know we have a vulnerable person and we want the community to feel responsible. One of the things I get really frustrated with is to say, if we all felt that, I always use this example. I live in Salt Lake City. In downtown, and we have a lot of homeless people in Salt Lake in downtown. And one of the things I often say to folks when they get annoyed by clutter or people living on the street or a mess or someone in the middle of the night making a lot of noise, I say, if we thought of homelessness as my individual issue, since I live in Salt Lake, every person on the street is my responsibility in some way, then it takes away a lot of that anger. And I go, well, what can I do to help that person get into a place where they can be more stable, be warm, be fed, get resources if they need it for health-related issues, instead of thinking of it as this person's a problem and in my space, this is a part of my community and a person who's actually reaching out for help. And I think of it in the same way with bystander intervention. When I see some harm going on, our gut instinct is to protect ourselves and stay away from it. But what would it be like if we created a cultural community where we could all get together and say, no, let's stop this? And bystander intervention tends to do that. When one person speaks up, other people will speak up and be supportive. And what we find when we train and teach and practice these kinds of skills is that most people want to do the right thing.
So that actually leads me to that's a concept that at Smart Defense we teach. And so tell me a little bit about your actual training. Is it in person, online course, seminar style? Like, how do you get your message across?
Yeah. So one of the things we did was a lot of the a lot of bystander intervention programs that are national and are assessed are very cost prohibitive. They're very expensive and hard for people to access. And so what we wanted to do was take the concept of bystander intervention and what it is and how you do it. Because really, in concept, it's not very complicated. In practice, it can be difficult and you have to practice those skills and learn new skills. But in concept, it's really simple. If you see something, try and speak up, do something direct or indirect to distract or shift of people from harm or violence. But so what we did was we created a program, we called it Upstanding. And that's free for anybody. If you contact me at the health department, I will send you the presentation. We actually just updated it very recently. The original one was directed more at sexual relationship violence. And we found that that was very hard, especially for teachers in junior high school and high school, because when you start talking about sexual violence, the topic gets difficult and they start needing permission and other things, because Utah is a socially conservative place. So we want to make sure we're honoring people's values and community values and those kinds of things. So we shifted it to be just more broad, safety and health focused. One of the things we often say is, I love this phrase, but you can't do a don't. Like, don't is really helpful. Don't drink if you're under 21. Don't date if you're under 60. Those are helpful as rules, but they're not helpful in practice if you don't tell them what they can do or what to do instead. So like, one of the things we're trying to shift in our focus too is promoting, like, what's the healthy choice? We can tell you what the unhealthy choice is, and we should inform on that. But we also need to then follow it up with, what's the healthy thing to do? What's the right thing? What makes these choices difficult? Because I remember being a teenager. I remember I was doing a presentation at a military base in Utah, and one of these officers was saying to me, if my kid was, saying something sexist or awful, I would sit him down and say, don't do that. This is wrong. This is bad. And I was like, okay, that's good. That's a good start. But also, like, I remember being a teenager and doing things that did not meet my parents' values or morals, right? Making choices or making jokes with friends or trying to be cool. And navigating youth and adolescence is very difficult. So how do we help in that? I got off on a tangent there, but I just think, like, the more we treat this in the way that it is complex, the better. But we created this template training, but we wanted to make sure that it was adjustable and tailorable for communities and places, that you could take parts of it and leave parts of it, add your own parts. But the training itself is about an hour and 20 minutes if you did it start to finish. And I can send this to you all if you'd like to see it. But we also, we're willing to, like, at the health department, come to your community, come to your school, come to your, I don't know if I'd go to someone wanted me to their house, but, like, come into your space and train you. What we'd love to do, honestly, is instead of just training just everyday people, train teachers. So that, because historically, when we talk about these issues, you would train experts in certain areas. So you'd have a rape prevention person from a domestic violence shelter or a rape crisis shelter going into the schools to educate. But we thought, how cool if we could educate teachers more broadly on bystander intervention so that they could continue these lessons. One of the biggest issues we have is dosage in these messaging. So, and this is actually, it's interesting with self-defense, this is a great example of this, that oftentimes self-defense's problem is someone goes in for a couple of weeks or a couple of sessions, and that's not going to really reinforce those skills. And so we want to make sure they go, these are soft skills that you have to practice and have to implement if you want to make sure that they're there when you need them, but also making sure, this is it's such a, I just think it's so important that we reinforce who's responsible and who's accountable for violence, but also we don't reinforce victim blaming too. And those kind of things can get very difficult. But your initial question was, well, how do we get bystander intervention and how do we do it? I don't know. At this point, whatever way we can, most of the time now we're reaching out to schools and communities. We are reaching out to domestic violence shelters who are doing community education on this work. We're working with some universities in the state. Some universities have their own bystander intervention programs. Some of them, Utah State's one that like adopted ours and then made it even better. And they're working within their communities to implement these programs. So really anywhere we can. One of the things I've discovered is when I go into communities, since I work for the state health department, communities know themselves much better than I do. And they know what's best for those spaces and places. So in any way we can be helpful and provide insight and resources, we want to, but I like to be as hands-off as possible to let folks do the things that will make our community safer and healthier.
Do you feel like communities and schools have been receptive to what you're teaching and what you're trying to help spread?
Slow and steady, yes. I mean, there's always risk associated. And Utah's a funky state. We, just like Utah is big into states' rights, communities and locales in Utah are big into local rights and choices and things like that. So there's very few mandates that the state can make. So adopting new things and bigger things. One of the things that's hard is people are very busy already. So trying to throw something else at them and do this new thing and survey these students in this way can seem overwhelming. So what we're trying to do is just slowly figure out ways to incorporate this in a way that doesn't feel like it's more work. But honestly, I think this approach will make it so we don't have to do a lot of the like repeated educations we're doing, because you can talk about bystander intervention if you're talking about suicide prevention, talk about bystander intervention if you're talking about alcohol prevention for underage drinking, or talk about it with sexual violence prevention.
I'm curious, have you guys been working with the program Speak Up, Be Safe? It feels like a really natural fit. And I know that's a government program that, I mean, I help teach it at the elementary schools. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm not sure if any of the community organizations we use are using that. I have not heard of that, but I will write it down because I'm curious.
Yeah, Speak Up, Be Safe. It's a great program, and I'm sure it's offered, for junior high and high school. But I've just been teaching it in the elementary schools, and It sounds like a really great fit. And also, I'm going to put you on the spot, but would you mind working with us with Smart Defense and developing something specific to our trainers as well as to our students?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is such a great thing. Like, I think there's so many little programs out there that we don't know about. Part of the biggest issue we have is communication and sharing. I think a lot of times we tend to reinvent the wheel, or we want to start something new or create something amazing instead of figuring out what's already there that we can use. So that's more reasonably priced or easy to access. But yeah, so yes, absolutely. And really, like, as more than anything, we also want to know what's going on at the state level, so we can go, hey, have you heard of Smart Safe? Have you heard of Speak Up, Be Safe as a program alternative to upstanding? If upstanding won't work for a variety of reasons, one of the things we say is like you can't have a in the can program that's great for everybody. That something that works in Salt Lake City is not necessarily going to work in Tremont in the same way. It's not going to work on the Navajo reservation in the same way. So like, how do you start to work with communities to adopt these things that they're like, oh, this is really useful. Oh, we're going to not use this, but also how do you make sure you can measure that and you can evaluate it? So, because that's important too. We need to make sure that the work we're doing is working, promoting less violence, promoting access to resources. Like, how do you make sure you're doing all of those scientific things while also allowing people to tailor a program to meet their community's needs the best? It's tricky. And we're getting better and better at it all the time. But actually, that to me is to me, meeting with folks and working with folks to I found just even hearing about this program, who knows now if I'm like, oh, this is amazing, we should be sending this out to every school district in the state, just as an alternative option to programs that they're doing. So.
Just listening to you, I mean, I can just hear like how much passion you have for this topic. And I hope you don't mind if I ask a little bit of a personal question, but I mean, I just feel like you have so much passion for it. I'm just kind of curious, how did you find your way into this line of work? If you don't mind me asking.
No, not at all. It was it's found my way into the work is really funny. It was almost accidental. When I was at the University of Utah for undergrad work, I was doing a variety of different studies in social sciences and bouncing around social science degrees. And then I started doing peer education with this team that did alcohol and drug, healthy relationships to drinking, but also like they dabbled in a bunch of different health issues. And one of the things they did was domestic violence and dating violence. I started like volunteering and started doing community education at the university on that topic, and then started getting more involved and found out there was a rape prevention program and team, like peer education team at the school, and got involved there. And then I kind of went down the rabbit hole because I switched my major to women's studies and got went a little. I went to me in a very good way. It's now gender studies. They've changed the name at the university, but and when I started doing that work, I then started volunteering at the Rape Recovery Center in Salt Lake County, doing community education and their crisis line. And you know, at that point, I think once you get involved in this work, and if it's meaningful to you, you tend to not be able to leave. Like I often say to people who do 40-hour trainings, to become a rape crisis advocate in the state of Utah, I help out with the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assaults trainings. And when I do a section of that training occasionally, and I often say, you're going to leave this training not just as advocates, but as activists, because you can't start to hear this stuff without starting to reevaluate it. You can't listen to music and watch movies in quite the same way. It's funny, I often say that John Hughes movies, which I grew up on, like 16 Candles and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, they have been in some ways ruined for me. But at the same time, they haven't been ruined because I can put them in cultural context and say, like, although there are some things in there that are not particularly appropriate by today's standards, especially around sex and alcohol and some other things, but they are important to my youth. So, but part of it is going like, this is the cool thing about using a new lens is how can I think about this stuff differently? But yeah, so I got involved in that work and I started doing it, and then I don't know if you've experienced, like, you start doing something and then you become an expert on it. Like, I didn't intend this, but it's the way it worked out. So,
like one more question out of curiosity. Yeah. I mean, at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about how a lot of men don't see this as a men's issue because they're not the ones out. That specific man's not out there perpetrating crimes or beating his partner or raping, a friend or daughter or, acquaintance. And so they don't tend to see it as a men's issue. Did you ever, if you ever heard of rape at some point in your life, did you think of it as a women's issue, or did it always seem
yeah. I mean, I would actually say one of the things I talk about frequently is that in high school, I was your average high school boy. I wasn't super popular, but I slut-shamed girls. I did all the horrible things that teenage boys do, and at the time didn't realize it, didn't think about it. It was culturally acceptable and appropriate, and I'm accountable for that. I've apologized to many women, not many, a few women that I've harmed in that process. When I was in high school, I mean, the worst part too is trying to evaluate, like, I was a product of my culture, but I also have accountability. And how do you learn to understand and situate yourself in that? I also can't totally beat myself up, but I can do work today to try and shift our cultural lens in our view. But I also don't I don't see me as better or more enlightened than most men out there. I see me as having a framework and an opportunity. I often will say this. I will say that I was taught, trained, and educated by hundreds and hundreds of women in this field to help me get a better gauge and understanding of my blind spots and thinking errors on this issue. And without the army of women to continue to challenge me and train me, I wouldn't be where I am today. And I'm a better person for that. But at the same time, I think, it's such a great question too, because I often joke with people that when I used to work at the University of Utah doing this work, and I've worked at Duke University and University of Maryland. So most of my professional experience has been in higher education, doing this work. And those tend to be very progressive environments. I then switched to the Department of Health, and now I work in a variety of places around the state, and places a lot of people have never heard of, Blanding, Peoria, Tremont, and Logan, all these places that people who don't live in Utah have never heard of, that have a variety of different frameworks and perspectives and insights on how the world works. I have become, I often say, like, I'm personally a fairly progressive person, but I am radically centrist in this work, because I don't think that being socially or personally conservative is a negative thing. I don't think being progressive or progressively operating progressively is a positive thing. I think it's who we are, and we need to figure out a place to meet to find out where common ground is. We're doing some work right now on pornography prevention. We're trying to create a pornography prevention program for teens in the state. And one of the reasons I get alarmed a little by some of the programs that are currently out there, because I think that we need to make sure we're being scientific. We need to make sure we are not criticizing young people for being curious about sex and sexuality in a healthy way. We need to differentiate sexual curiosity from inappropriate behavior. And we are doing this very poorly in the state. We tend to think of pornography as like, this is a horrible, awful, terrible thing, or this is my civil right. And like, those are bad arguments for protect. So one of the things, though, is we're working with, we're hoping to work more closely, and we have representatives from the LDS Church and from the Department of Health and from BYU and from the University of Utah and all these places to get a broad range of viewpoints and research to make sure that the prevention program we're doing for teens is healthy and not stigmatizing and doesn't tell people that being curious about sex. I often joke that the presentation I used to do when I first started trying to create this program with some other folks was, I titled it after my friend's 9-year-old son's porn search, because he left it in a Google window. And his search was girls' boobs, which is just adorable. Like, that's adorable. And I'm not worried about a 9-year-old who's curious about breasts. What I'm terrified of is what happens when he types it into a search engine and hits enter, and then gets everything I know he's going to get that is way too not okay for a 9-year-old brain. And one of the things, so I to this whole long narrative was to say, one of the things we went and met on was, we have a lot of disagreements about this very complex issue, especially as you get into commercial sex work and, like, how do you protect the people working in this industry? How do you protect the people consuming it? Like, when they're doing it of legal age, it gets very complex. What I did say was, what is our area of common ground? We all want people under the age of 18 to not be able to access age inappropriate content. Sexually explicit material for people under age 18 is inappropriate. We all agree on that. Let's move on that. And this, to me, is the same with all of these other health issues, or with bystander prevention or anything else. Where are our areas of common ground? And then where can we make sure you're able to control your environment and what gets in your brain and what doesn't, and that kind of thing. And I think, like, getting upset that we disagree instead of finding those areas of commonality is exactly the problem now. And I think we can fix this. It's kind of where we're going culturally and socially, but we have an opportunity now to say, okay, cool. It's okay, we disagree. In fact, the world's a much more interesting, cool place when we disagree, and especially a group of people who are in a room disagreeing to try and help people's health and safety. That's a nice place for me to be, whether I agree with you or not. So, yeah, and to me, like, I like the idea of having these broader conversations, and I like the notion that I'm wrong. I think 25-year-old me would be like, oh, Marty's a sellout. Right? I'm sure he would have problems with me, with 42-year-old Marty. But I do know, like, that we have a lot of people who need support and help. And the best way to get information is not to alienate or stigmatize people for how they live their lives, or their world they live in, or the choices that they make. And more importantly, to say, like, here's what we know is healthy. Here's what we know can be unhealthy. I actually love our framing at after my women's studies degree, I got a degree in health education from the University of Utah. And I really like the public health framework. Public health is a really good framing because it removes a lot of stigma and just says healthy or unhealthy, not good or bad or right or wrong. Just, this can be less healthy. I mean, one of the examples too is smoking. Smoking we have turned into the most like, ew, you're gross, you're bad, you smell. Instead of like, I would say it's bad for your health. It's in the long run, tobacco use is bad for your health. So this is a much better framing to me to talk to people about their healthy choices instead of telling them they're gross and awful and bad. Because it just, and you know, gross and awful and bad works for a few people, but how do we make sure our approach works for everybody?
Well, if they're sexual predators, I'm just going to stick it in.
Yeah.
Gross and bad and bad.
I would agree. Some people do not get the benefit of healthy or unhealthy. Absolutely, they get and there should be stigma. I mean, that's such a great example, actually, when we talk about predatory behavior or sexist, like there's certain behaviors that we should socially stigmatize. That people should get up and go. I often think if someone's walking down the street and a person starts catcalling, and then 3 people on the street turn to them and go, "What are you doing?" That's totally inappropriate. That's pretty gross. That's rude. That person who did that is going to be like, oh, okay, there's a social and cultural cost to my behavior, not just a cost to my psyche for harming somebody and threatening somebody.
Marty, I want to have you back to talk about rape culture, because I think that is such a misunderstood. Well, in my circles, I found that like I have my own basic understanding of what rape culture is. I mean, talking about social stigmas and things like that. And then also speaking to my friends from all walks of life that have no clue what rape culture is. And that's a whole other podcast, but I love where you're going with this, the social stigmas and the all the other information you're giving us. I feel like we could have 4 different podcasts on so many different things with you.
Yeah. Well, and your point's so good. I think that in a lot of cases, these issues are all connected to each other. That like when we talk about adverse childhood experience and then pile on top of that rape culture and stigmatization and sexual stigmatization, especially for girls. The worst part right now is a lot of these cultural issues that we tend to ignore, things like slut shaming, they reinforce this inability for people to live healthy sex lives, healthy relational lives, to make healthy choices. And so, and also, and one of this is, we were talking about this before, but this is also when we start realizing why people are using alcohol at a really young age or using drugs at a really young age. It's often, sometimes it's because it's, you know, you're experimenting as a teenager and doing risky things. And sometimes you're self-medicating for past trauma. And sometimes you're doing survival drug use, which again, if people don't know what that term means, look it up. It's like that when we talk about homelessness and all of these issues are uniquely or have areas where there's, if we did a big Venn diagram with all of these health issues, there's tons of shared areas associated with them. And so how do we start to attack those shared areas where we're using less resource, less money, less person power to do that and help as many people as we can? And again, I don't want to minimize the complexity of this. And I appreciate, Elizabeth, your comment too, of like that in some ways there's going to be a line drawn. There is a line in the sand at behavior and attitudes, and there has to be appropriate consequences and accountability for behavior. And how do we start talking about that? Like, how do we talk about the kid in school who's like, Sally's a slut, she sleeps with everybody and spreads this rumor, versus someone who grabs Sally in the school? Those are very different things. Those are both bad and both need to be addressed. So how do we start to manage those kinds of issues? And really, to me, what you're doing with this podcast, what the work you've done in the past is it. You're creating a space and an environment for us to talk about this and not making it stigmatized or weird to do it. That it's not odd to have this conversation, that we shouldn't be uncomfortable that bad things happen. What we should do is go, oh, how do we mitigate that and make less and less bad things happen in the future? And these platforms are amazing. And especially your connection to a socially conservative environment in Utah, that is an amazing access point to people who aren't getting this information in other places. And that, again, not a good thing or a bad thing, just what a unique opportunity to create space for people to have these conversations in ways that feel safe, in ways that feel friendly. There's a great, we were talking about pornography. One of the organizations we're working with is a group called Upward Reach, who's trying to create a cell text service. So it sends a text to moms or dads. parents in general and says, here's how to have this conversation. And we actually use the term sexually explicit material or media because pornography has been so stigmatized that people kind of lose their heads over it. So we say sexual, but it's creating a space to go, I don't want you to talk to my kid about this in school. I don't want you, but what I do want is, as I feel uncomfortable, I have a lack of knowledge on this topic. How do I start talking about it? And to me, this is exactly it too. Like, how do we start talking about healthy relationships with our kids in a way that is meaningful? We start talking about it and we figure out ways to do it. And then we fail a little bit and do it wrong and embarrass ourselves and then correct and come back and do it better the next time. So this to me is such a neat thing you're doing, and incorporating a self-empowerment component to this is really critical. And it's interesting, the field of sexual violence historically, and I'm sure you all have heard this, like we had a love-hate relationship in the late 80s, early 90s with self-defense, right? Because we thought self-defense can be victim blaming, because you say, oh, you learned this new skill and tool to keep yourself safe, and now you were victimized again. You should have been able to, it's that whole should have, instead of going, no, people cross boundaries and lines. That's bad and wrong, and they need to be held accountable for that. And you feeling empowered to take a stand, to feel more control of your body, of yourself, your autonomy is a really good thing. So how do we balance those two things out? And I used to, I often say, I've been in this field for 21 years now, and I have gone through some evolutions repeatedly about, what I used to think. And what I know now is how little I know and how open we need to be to a variety of approaches for people. So.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for making time to chat with us today. I really, really appreciate it. And I definitely echo Mio's sentiment when she said we want to have you back and talk about rape culture, because I think that is also another topic that is, I feel like the word is tossed around a lot, but people don't actually really understand fully what it means. So I definitely want to have you back to talk about that, because I feel like it's super important. And for everyone watching today, I love what has been spoken about. And one of the things that really spoke to me personally, and I hope it speaks to each one of you, is that this is not a women's issue. This is not just a men's issue. This is a humanity issue. It affects us both. It's as was mentioned, as Marty mentioned earlier, this is vastly dominated by male perpetrators, but that doesn't mean that every man is bad. Most men are wonderful. I mean, the men in my life are wonderful. My husband is wonderful. I have a son. I mean, he's 3 years old, but he's wonderful. He's certainly not perpetrating crimes, but the majority of men are good. But this is an issue for all of humanity. And so as you go home today, whether you're a woman or a man listening to this podcast today, go home and talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your partners about this, because this is an issue that all of us need to have conversations and understanding. And the context in which Marty has given us to talk about it is wonderful. You don't have to, yes, there are definite lines in the sand. And if you need me to draw them out for you, I will. But we can also talk about it in a healthy versus an unhealthy context. I mean, just start with relationships. What does a healthy relationship look like? And what does an unhealthy relationship look like? What is healthy masculinity? And what is unhealthy masculinity? And the same for femininity. I mean, the same for both of us. I think this is just a great, great spot for all of us to begin. So as you go out today, talk to your family, talk to your friends, make sure that everyone that you come into contact with or that you have a good relationship with, that they realize that this is not just a women's issue, this is an issue for humanity. So with that being said, I want to say thank you again to Marty. I've loved everything that you've said, and we look forward to everyone tuning in again next time for our next episode of Smart Talks, and I will see you all soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.